Well, this lecture is part two of the teleological argument for God's existence. And just to recap where we ended off last time, we were looking at one particular kind of teleological argument known as the fine-tuning argument for God's existence. Now, there are two different versions of the fine-tuning argument. There's what's called cosmic fine-tuning, and there's local fine-tuning. We're not going to talk really too much about local fine-tuning, but in our last lecture, we focused primarily on cosmic fine-tuning. And cosmic fine-tuning arguments look at the universe as a whole, and they ask what needs to be true about the various parameters or constants of the universe for life to be possible. So the cosmic fine-tuning argument is only about the possibility of life. So just to give you some examples of these constants, the strong nuclear force. If that were slightly more powerful or slightly weaker, life would not be possible anywhere in the universe. And here we're thinking specifically about carbon-based life. Or the weak nuclear force. If that were slightly different, life wouldn't be possible anywhere. Or the initial entropy arrangements of the early universe. The physicist and mathematician Roger Penrose says, if those conditions were changed by just 1 part in 10 to the 10 to the 123rd power, life would not be possible. You also have the gravitational constant, the electromagnetic force. But if you add up all of these constants and you change any of them just slightly, life wouldn't be possible. And so the argument is if all of these arrangements seem to be finely tuned for the possibility of life, then that suggests that design must be the best explanation. And the reason why somebody would conclude this is they would say chance doesn't work, necessity doesn't work, chance and necessity working together don't work, and if those aren't the best explanations, then the design argument is the only alternative. And therefore, if there's a designer, or if there's design, there must be a designer, and that's what we mean when we say God. So that's the fine-tuning argument. And I want to stress at this point that fine-tuning arguments are about the possibility of life. But when we go to our next type of teleological argument, this deals with the probability that life would actually originate. So now we're moving away from physics and cosmology, and we're focusing on really chemistry. So what are the chances that the material elements that we have in the known universe would produce a self-replicating system? And to understand this argument, I think it's helpful to understand the different components that make up life. So we can think of life at the highest level in terms of organisms. I suppose you can go higher than that too, and you can look at ecosystems, but we're just going to focus on organisms. And if you ask what makes up an organism, how are organisms designed? Well, they're designed by organs. Now, if we go back to William Paley's argument, when he's constructing his design argument, he's focusing on the arrangement of organisms and also the arrangement of organs. And his most famous example was the design of the eye. So the eye is an organ. But the way that teleological arguments are constructed today, at least when it comes to the origin of life, is they want to break it down even further. So how do you get an organ? Well, organs are broken down into 4 different types of tissues. And tissues, furthermore, are broken down into cells. So if we're focusing just on the human body, there's about 37.2 trillion cells in the human body. And that further can be broken down into proteins. So proteins are what makes the cell function. So they represent the various different parts that are in the cell. And a typical cell has about 42 million proteins to make the cell function. You can break proteins down furthermore into amino acids. And so we have 20 different types of amino acids. And then you can break that down even further into the various elements of the periodic table. And furthermore, you can break that down into atoms. So now we're talking about protons, neutrons, electrons, and you can even break those down into up quarks, down quarks. And this is the material stuff that makes life. So when we're talking about the origin of life, we're talking about the origin of a cell. At least presumably that's what we're talking about. You might say that the cell is the simplest of living systems. And so we want to figure out what information do we have concerning how a simple cell or a self-replicating system originated. And I think it's helpful to go back to an experiment. It's an old experiment now that was first conducted in 1952 by Stanley Miller. It's sometimes called the Miller-Urey Experiment. And in this experiment, they were trying to figure out how you'd get the building blocks of life, the amino acids. And so they put various gases into a chamber, they heated it up, and when they got the gases such as water, nitrogen, carbon dioxide, carbon monoxide, ammonia, methane, hydrogen, when they got those into a single chamber in a gas form, they sent a surge of electricity through it to simulate lightning. And in this experiment, they ended up coming up with some amino acids. Last time I checked, I think their laboratory produced probably over 20 different amino acids in this experiment. And so if we go back to what it takes to get life, what we've gotten so far with the Miller-Urey experiment, and that's about as far as we've gotten, is we have one experiment that shows us something about how you might get amino acids. But now that's still a long way from getting life. So to get to a cell, you need those amino acids. So you can think of amino acids sort of, so they're the building blocks of life. You can think of it sort of as the matter, the material stuff that you need. Or if you want an analogy, I like to think of the analogy of alphabet soup. So if you have the letters of the alphabet in alphabet soup, you have the actual letters, that's the material stuff. But now those letters need to be arranged in a specific order for you to get a sentence. Well, it turns out this is also how it is when it comes to getting a functional protein. So if you want to get one functional protein, you have to string together amino acids in the right order to get one properly functioning protein fold. If you change the order of the amino acids, you don't get a protein fold and you don't get a functional protein. And so this is one of the ways to think about just the relationship of what we've gotten in the Stanley Miller experiment to the relationship of the origin of life. You need to get amino acids. They need to fold into proteins. They need to be strung together to fold into proteins, and proteins build up a functioning cell. And so to understand the problem of getting to the origin of life, I'm going to quote James Tour, who is a synthetic chemist from Rice University, who has done some work on the origin of life problem. And he says, from a synthetic chemical perspective, neither I nor any of my colleagues can fathom a prebiotic molecular route to construction of a complex system. And I think would be helpful to just pause for a moment to think about what he's saying here. So when he talks about prebiotic, that just means pre-life, pre-biology. And so what he's trying to imagine is how do you get chemicals in a prebiotic world before there's life? How do you imagine a molecular route from those chemicals to move to a complex system? So this is what he's thinking about. Because in biology, we have mechanisms for thinking about this. We have mutation. We have natural selection. There's genetic drift. You have different types of mechanisms that you can propose in evolution. We also have better ways of understanding how DNA replicates. But you don't have any of that pre-biology. And so he's trying to imagine a prebiotic molecular route to construction of a complex system. He goes on to say, we can't even figure out the prebiotic routes to the basic building blocks of life. So here he's thinking about carbohydrates, nucleic acids, lipids, and proteins. Chemists are collectively bewildered. Hence, I say that no chemist understands prebiotic synthesis of the requisite building blocks, let alone assembly into a complex system. So here's maybe a helpful picture for understanding what it is that Tour is getting at. So if you ask the question, so how do we get just the basic building blocks of life? Well, we have the Miller-Urey experiment. And so let's just imagine a simplified version of the Miller-Urey experiment and imagine that our laboratory is the globe that you see on your screen, because this is where it needs to happen. It has to happen somewhere on Earth. So thankfully we have an abundance of water, so that's not a problem. But let's just say we only need three other chemicals. We need hydrogen, we need methane, and we need ammonia. Well, to reconstruct the Miller-Urey experiment in a real life situation, I guess there's not life in this, but in a real world situation, you have to imagine those chemicals arriving in a specific spot on Earth. So this is what he's thinking about, I think, when he's talking about a prebiotic molecular route. How do you get those chemicals to a single location like you have in the Miller-Urey experiment? And how do you get it to the single location? And at that time that you get it to the single location, that's when you get lightning. How does that happen? He says that chemists are collectively bewildered when it comes to imagining a scenario of this happening. And so you could ask the question, is chance the best explanation for this event to occur, necessity, or is the combination of the two? And if you don't think that chance, necessity, or the combination of the two are the best explanation, then you might say that design is the best explanation. And certainly an advocate of the teleological argument would say that design is the best explanation for the origin of life. Now we can think about this further. Let's say you do have that event that does happen. You do get the building blocks, and you get the 20 amino acids that you get in the Miller-Urey experiment. Well, now you're still not really close to the origin of life, because you have to string those amino acids together in the right sequence to get one protein fold. So if you ask, what's the probability of getting a single functioning protein fold? And this has been calculated by a biochemist named Douglas Axe. And he has published papers on this, that the probability of getting one protein fold is about 1 part in 10 to the 48th power, which is about 1 in a trillion, 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 trillion. And so just to get an analogy of what this means, it would be like if you were sick and you went to the kitchen to get a bowl of soup, and the soup was already prepared for you as alphabet soup. And when you look at your alphabet soup, the letters are arranged in a sequence that say, drink plenty of fluids and get rest until you are feeling better. Now, if you looked at that sequence and you asked, what is the probability that that sequence occurred by chance, necessity, chance and necessity working together? Well, it's about 1 in a trillion, 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 trillion. And so you could ask, well, what's the best explanation for this arrangement? Should we say that it was chance and necessity working together? Or does it make more sense to say that it was designed? This is basically what the argument is for design when it comes to the origin of life. To get a functional protein, amino acids must be arranged in a specific order, much like the alphabet soup. And furthermore, that arrangement seems to be determined by the information stored in DNA. So you need to have information, and advocates of the design argument will say that chance and necessity are not sufficient to explain this. But of course you could ask the question, well, could we fix this problem if we increased our probabilistic resources? That is, if we had enough time. So we have chance and necessity, but we don't just have chance and necessity. If we have enough time, could we imagine a scenario where this improbable sequence would occur? Now, again, it's important to remember that the improbable sequence that we're talking about is just to get one functioning protein fold. You still need about 42 million proteins to get life. So we're not even close to life at that point. But if we added time, would that help our problem? Well, I'm going to turn again to James Tour, where he gives his answer to this question. So let's watch.
People will often say to me, oh, if you wait long enough, it'll form. No, time is your enemy. Inorganic chemistry. Time is your enemy. You make something, you right away store it in a precious place, because if air hits it or ammonia hits it, it falls apart. They're kinetic products. Very often they are the kinetic product, meaning that they form first, but they're not the most stable. The most stable is junk. Reagent addition order is critical. You have to add A, and then B, and then C. You can't just throw it all together. It doesn't work that way. It just doesn't work that way. Try cooking, an elaborate French dinner. I bought all this stuff. I just add it all together. And chemistry is the same way. You can't do that. How does nature know what to add? How does it add one and then the other and then the other? And when these guys do their prebiotic chemistry, say, look what we got. Yeah, because you added A and then B and then C, and you bought A and you bought B and you bought C. The parameters of temperature, pressure, solvent, light or no light, pH, oxygen, moisture, no moisture, has to be carefully controlled to build complex molecular structures. The characterization at each step is essential, but hard in a prebiotic system. How do you characterize it? Biology characterizes everything. Everything that's made, enzymes check it. And if it's not right, another enzyme comes and rips out that wrong base and fixes it in the DNA. But this is a prebiotic world. You don't have any of this. How do you bring up more starting material from the rear? Anytime you want to make a complex system, you go along and then you run out of starting material because you were trying many things, and then you go back and you make some more, and then you go back and how does nature go back? It just spent 1 billion years building something, and now, I ran out of starting material. Well, just go back and make some more. I would, but I never kept a laboratory notebook. I forgot what I had done 1 billion years ago. You see the problem. How many organic chemists are here? Okay, do you know what I'm talking about? Isn't this true? It just doesn't work. None of this works. And this is what they publish paper on after paper, and it gets into Nature and the science. I'm like, you're crazy. And there's no accounting here. There's no accounting. So one guy makes ribose in a 0.1% yield with all the other carbohydrates in there, and they identify it by mass spec. And then the next researcher starts with ribose. Say, okay, ribose has been made, so we'll start with that. Now, no. Start with the junk that he made. You don't buy ribose with all the chiral centers in place that came from a natural source. None of it works. So critical for life is the origin of information. So this is just making the basic molecules. Now you got the whole information. It's not just the nucleic acids, it's the order in which they're arranged. The information is primary, the matter is secondary. Information is primary. You can write information on a piece of paper, then transfer it to your computer, put it up in the cloud, and now it's in some server form. The matter can change. The information is primary. This is
Well, just to sum up what Tour was saying at this point, so if you ask, can we fix the problem by adding time to chance and necessity, Tour's argument is that you can't. It maybe would be something that you could do in biology. If you add time to natural selection plus chance mutations, then time would give you a lot of opportunities to make significant changes in biology. But he's talking about a prebiotic world. He's talking about chemistry. And he says in chemistry, when you do synthetic chemistry and you bring together different chemical elements, the elements are oftentimes unstable. And if you add a lot of time to it, they're going to break down. This is why he says that time is your enemy when it comes to organic chemistry. Well, now we can look at another version of the teleological argument that deals with biology. Now, I should probably say at this point that there are many advocates of the teleological argument that maybe wouldn't buy into the biological argument. So there are some that will say they are advocates of the teleological argument when it comes to the fine-tuning, when it comes to the origin of life, but not when it comes to biology. So I think it's important just to recognize that you could be an advocate of the teleological argument while not adhering to every different example that is being given here. But I'll give you the biological argument for design to see if you find it persuasive. And here you're still using the same method for trying to detect whether or not design is a good explanation. Is chance the best explanation, necessity a combination of the two, or is design the best explanation? And when it comes to biology, one of the things that's useful is that we at least have some mechanisms that we can work with here. So when we think of chance as a mode of causation, if we ask what would be a good mechanism that would relate to chance in biology, well, it might be mutation. So arguably, mutation is a chance event that happens. Sometimes it's called random mutations. And then selection, natural selection, you might say, is best represented by necessity as a mode of causation. So again, natural selection is the mechanism, necessity is the mode of causation. And so one account of how life develops over time is that you have random mutations coupled with natural selection, and that explains the full diversity of life. Now, somebody who is an advocate for a teleological argument when it comes to biology might try to figure out examples or find examples in life where design seems to be the best explanation for why some features of life have originated. And just to give you one example here, it's a common example that was proposed by the biochemist Michael Behe in his book Darwin's Black Box. I believe it was published originally in 1996. One illustration that he gave for design is the bacterial flagellum. So in his book, he argued that the flagellar motor is what he calls irreducibly complex. And wherever you have an irreducibly complex system, you have a system, according to Behe, that is best explained by design. So what is irreducible complexity? Well, put simply, irreducible complexity is any system that if you take one part away from that system, the system no longer functions. So one illustration that he used was a mousetrap. So a mousetrap is made of 5 different parts. You have a hammer, you have a catch, you have a wood base, you have a spring. If you take out any one of those parts, the whole system will not function as a mousetrap. And so he asks, are there any features in nature, in biology, that are irreducibly complex? And he argues that the flagellar motor is a system that is irreducibly complex. He says it's made of 40 different structural proteins, and 30 of those proteins work specifically for that system, so that if you take out any of those proteins, the system won't work. And if the system won't work, he can't imagine a scenario where chance mutations and natural selection are sufficient to explain how this irreducibly complex system might have occurred. And so this might be an example of design. Now, I think it's also important to point out at this point that if you remember back to an earlier lecture, I said that design arguments are always arguments from analogy. So if you look at Behe's early versions of the teleological argument, he asked the question, if you find a watch in the woods, is the watch best explained by design? He said yes. And if you try to figure out what properties make us infer that the watch is designed, we might say that it's complex. There's different parts that work together to fulfill specific functions, such as telling time. And so that gives us the inference that this system must be designed. Now, if you compare those properties with a rock doesn't have those features. There's not many different complex parts in a rock that make it serve the function of being a rock. It's a very simple thing. And so we don't infer that a rock is designed. But now if you compare a watch with an eye, a human eye, or if you compare the rock with the human eye, you might ask, what does the human eye resemble the most? Does it resemble the watch more, or does it resemble the rock? Behe argued that if you say that it resembles the watch, then you have a good reason for thinking that the human eye was designed. But again, that's an argument from analogy. So you're looking at a human artifact and you're comparing it to biology, to an organ. Well, now when it comes to something like the bacterial flagellar motor, if you ask, well, what would that compare to? Well, here I'm going to use James Tour again. So in his laboratory at Rice University, one of the things that they do as synthetic chemists is they make molecular machines, nanomachines actually. So I have a picture of one of their nano cars that they make. They actually race these things. It's pretty cool. And these are designed nano machines that they make, chemical machines that they make. And they're actually quite simple, but they're machines that are clearly designed for a purpose. And so what you might say is if Tour's nanomachines are designed, and they're far simpler than systems that we find in nature, such as the bacterial flagellum, would it be reasonable to infer that some of the things that we find in nature, such as the bacterial flagellum, is also designed? So that would be an argument from analogy that you might use at this point as well. But again, this is a teleological argument as it relates to biology. And specifically, we're asking the question concerning the evolution of life, is it ever reasonable to infer design as the best explanation for some systems like the flagellar motor? But we could also take that question and we can talk about the evolution of consciousness. And this might also represent a version of the teleological argument where we're trying to figure out how does unconscious evolution or unguided evolution produce human consciousness. So if we're looking at the mechanisms of evolution, whether we're talking about mutation, natural selection, or some other natural mechanism, how would any of those mechanisms produce a conscious agent? So concerning our consciousness or cognitive faculties, is it ever reasonable to infer that design is the best explanation? And I want to give you an argument that was put forward by Alvin Plantinga. You've already been introduced to Plantinga in this class so far. But he has an argument that I think resembles a teleological argument of sorts. And it's an argument called, that he coins, the Evolutionary Argument Against Naturalism. Now, Plantinga isn't disputing the fact of evolution. He's actually going to make an argument that if you're a naturalist, so again, a naturalist is somebody that doesn't believe in God, or to use the words of Carl Sagan, the cosmos is all that is, all that was, all that ever will be. So if you're a naturalist, Plantinga argues, and you also believe in evolution, so you believe in both of those, you're a naturalist and you believe in evolution, then you actually have a defeater for your position. And here's how he presents the argument. He presents it in an equation. So on your screen you see P parentheses R slash N and E close parentheses is extremely low. Well, all that means is the probability, so that's P, that R, and this is that our cognitive faculties are reliable, given naturalism, that's N, and evolution is extremely low. Or in other words, he says it's really improbable that our cognitive faculties would be reliable if both naturalism and evolution were true. And if that's the case, he says this provides a defeater, and a defeater just means a reason not to believe R. So it provides a defeater for R. Well, what is R? It's the proposition that our cognitive faculties are reliable. But now this is a problem. If we can't rationally affirm R, then Plantinga argues we can't rationally affirm naturalism or evolution. Well, why is that? Well, because if our cognitive faculties, and so just to be clear of what we mean when we're talking about our cognitive faculties, we're talking about all of our sense perceptions, our ability to reason, which to do science, you need to have sense perceptions and you have to be able to reason. So those are all produced by your cognitive faculties. Well, if your cognitive faculties are not reliable, then anything you use your cognitive faculties for, anything that you learn using your cognitive faculties would also not be reliable because your cognitive faculties are not reliable. And so presumably people who say they believe in evolution and believe in naturalism believe in it because they think that they're reasonable. They're using their cognitive faculties to defend evolution and to defend naturalism. But if naturalism and evolution are both true, then the probability that our cognitive faculties are reliable is really low, and therefore we can't trust our cognitive faculties, which means we have no reason to affirm naturalism and evolution. This is Plantinga's argument. Now, if you ask, well, what's his alternative to this? He argues, and this is why I think he is presenting a version of the teleological argument. He argues that if our cognitive faculties are not designed, then we have no reason to trust them. And so these might be what are called the preconditions for reasoning, or you might say the preconditions for doing science, according to Plantinga. You have to assume that your cognitive faculties are functioning properly, because if you don't assume that, then you can't know anything. 2, you also have to assume that your cognitive environment, that's just whatever it is that you're trying to study, is similar to your cognitive faculties. So those are 2 basic assumptions you need to make. He also argues that you have to assume that the correspondence between the 2, that is your cognitive faculties and your cognitive environment, is the result of a good design plan. And that's also part of 4, that the design plan is good. If you make those assumptions, then he says it's reasonable to think that our cognitive faculties provide true information. And then he says, then we have reasons to think that evolution is true because we have cognitive faculties that work. But we would never have a reason to think that naturalism is true, according to Plantinga. To think of this argument in a slightly different way, you might just think about what's called the mind-body problem. So if you ask yourself, what is consciousness? Or if you ask the question, what causes thought? What causes us to have any perceptions? So if you walk outside and you see trees, you believe that there's trees all over the place because you're seeing trees. But the reason why you believe in trees is because of your 5 senses. You can see them, you can taste them, you can touch them. Well, what causes all of that perception to happen? Well, if you're a naturalist, Plantinga would say that the sensation that you have of seeing something begins with light. And so light is a physical property. So we're just talking about physics at this level. It passes through your eye, hits your retina, the cones and the rods. It translates that into a signal that goes back to your optic nerve, that goes back to your visual cortex, and then eventually it produces perception that you have. And all of this can be explained by physical cause and effect. So light waves produce signals, signals produce perception. But all of that, according to a naturalist, from a materialist, naturalist point of view, is something that is completely physical. And so if you're an advocate of the teleological argument, you might ask, is all of this the result of chance and necessity? What explains all of the beliefs that I have? So in Plantinga's argument, what explains why I think that evolution is true? Or what explains why I think that naturalism is true? Well, if naturalism actually is true, then every thought that I have is reduced to the various circuits in my brain, which are reduced further to neurons, which are reduced to synaptic firing. So there's about 100 trillion of those that happen. And at the deepest level, we could explain those at the level of molecules. And you can go deeper than that if you want. But all of that is just chance and necessity. So essentially, all of your thoughts are the result of chance and necessity, according to this argument. And to put the argument in the words of C.S. Lewis, so he represents kind of an earlier version of Plantinga's Evolutionary Argument Against Naturalism, where he writes, "It seems to me immensely unlikely that mind is a mere byproduct of matter. For if my mental processes are determined wholly by the motions of atoms in my brain, I have no reason to suppose that my beliefs are true." Because again, this is chance and necessity working. It's not design. He goes on to say, they may be sound chemically, but that does not make them sound logically. And hence, I have no reason for supposing my brain to be composed of atoms. At least not merely atoms. And so this is another version of the teleological argument. What is the best explanation for our cognitive faculties? Do they really reduce to chance and necessity, or is design ever the best explanation? Now we can also get at this in one more way. So we started this discussion in our previous lecture looking at Pele's watchmaker argument. And if you ask, do we have reasons to assume or infer that the watch is designed, or is chance and necessity the best explanation for it? Well, if you say that the watch is designed, then somebody who likes the teleological argument would ask, well, what is it that made the watch? Well, it was human consciousness that made the watch. But now, what becomes of your claim that the watch is designed if human consciousness is not also designed? Would it not also be the case then that the watch is not designed? At least this is how the argument would go. In other words, you can set up the argument on a continuum, and you could ask the question, at what point is it responsible to infer design as the best explanation? Is it the fine-tuning of the universe? Is that the best place to infer design? Is it the teleological argument, the diversity of life, consciousness, or do we have to wait until we get to the watch to infer design? And why do we make these choices? Now, somebody who is an advocate for the teleological argument would say we might as well start at the beginning with the fine-tuning. And furthermore, an advocate of the teleological argument would look at Dan Dennett's statement, at the root of human belief in gods lies the disposition to attribute agency to anything complicated that moves. Well, somebody who thinks the teleological argument is a good argument would say the reason why we attribute agency to anything complicated that moves is because when you have complicated things that move, the best explanation is that those things are in fact designed.